Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at an overview of the life of Abraham. As we noted previously, the Abraham narrative begins in chapter 12. Actually, he's introduced in the latter part of chapter 11. But in chapter 12, God comes to him and gives him certain promises where Abram is called to leave his family. He's given the promise of a seed, and he's going to be a blessing. Then we come to chapter 12, verses 10 through 20, and there we read of how Abraham, or he's still Abram at this time, he goes down into Egypt, and there's that incident where he says to everyone, this isn't my wife, this is my sister, and Sarai is taken by the Egyptian Pharaoh, but then he finds out, and she's returned to Abram, and he sojourns in Egypt, he stays in Egypt, but then he leaves Egypt, and he brings Sarai back with him. We have in chapter 13 where Lot and Abram go through some negotiations about who's going to be where, because the land just can't contain them all, and they have a parting of the ways, but then they briefly come back together in chapter 14 where Abram rescues Lot, and as well as the people of Sodom who have also been taken captive. Abram comes to the rescue. He rescues Lot. He rescues the king of Sodom, and he also has an interesting meeting with another king living in the land, a king named Melchizedek, a king of Salem, the ancient name of Jerusalem. In chapter 15, Abram is again given promises by God. He prepares a sacrifice, and he goes through a covenant ceremony with God, and it's described in detail as God promises that he will have descendants and he will have the land, and God seals that with a covenant ceremony. Now we come to chapter 16, and we have Operation Hagar, where Abram has a son by his wife's handmaiden Hagar, and that son's name is Ishmael. And chapter 16 describes both the birth of the child, as well as her running away and then coming back, and she's given some promises by God as well. Chapter 17, God comes and enters into a covenant, gives covenant promises with Abraham, and changes his name from Abram to Abraham. And so that Abrahamic Covenant now is ratified, even though you'd had the sign of the covenant ceremony earlier in chapter 15. Now that covenant is specifically said to be cut with Abraham. Here we have the Abrahamic Covenant. And that's a pivotal point, because now we're going to read about Abraham and Ishmael both being circumcised. That's the rest of that chapter. In the same way we'd had Abram preparing a sacrifice, now he prepares a meal as God shows up, and initially it's 3 people, and you find out later on that 2 of them are angels, and then one is speaking as though he's the Lord. And God gives promises that Sarai is going to give birth to a son, and it's going to be Isaac. She has a little bit of a chuckle over that, and so because of that, God says, you're going to name him Isaac, chuckling or laughter. And so in the same way that Abram had prepared a sacrifice, now he prepares a meal. Next, in chapter 8, at the rest of chapter 18, we again have Lot entering the story. And in the same way that Lot and Abram had negotiated who's going to go where, this time Abram is negotiating with God, and the negotiations are over Lot and especially over the city of Sodom. Are you going to bring judgment on Sodom if there are 50 righteous people? Well, how about 40? Well, how about 30? Well, how about 20? Well, how about 10? And again, there's a rescue of Lot, because there's not even 10 righteous people in the city. The city's going to be destroyed. But instead of Abram rescuing Lot, this time it's those 2 angels that go down and they rescue Lot, and Sodom is destroyed. We come to chapter 20, and again there's another sojourn, but this time it's not in Egypt. This time it's in Gerar, and again we have an echo of that same problem. She's not my wife, she's my sister, dealing with Sarai. And this time you find out that really she is the half-sister of Abram. And we say, ooh, that's sort of gross, but that wasn't considered so rare in that day and age. It's not something we do now. And indeed, by the time we get to the Torah, to the book of Exodus, that's going to be something where, or actually it'll be in Leviticus, where God's going to say, don't do that any longer. But there's that sojourn in Gerar. And finally, we come full circle. We had started with promises given, and now promises are fulfilled as we see the birth of Isaac, and we'll see Hagar and Ishmael are going to be sent out in the same way that Abram had been called to leave his family, where now Hagar and Ishmael will be sent out. They'll leave the family. And the promised seed will be taken and offered to God on an altar. And that will be the climactic part of the story, part of the Abram narrative. Now, he's still there afterwards, but this is the sort of the sum total of the Abram narrative, as Isaac is offered on the altar, and God brings a substitute. So that's going to be the overall story of Abram.